This video is going to cover the basics of using the Pathfinder window, which is right here on my screen inside Adobe Illustrator. To get this window open, if you don't have it open already, just go to Window, and then about 2/3 down, there's a link for the Pathfinder. Just make sure there's a checkbox next to it, and then your window should be open. And before I dive into all these different options right here, there's one thing that's important to know before you start applying effects. For example, this box right here has a stroke around it. As you can see, if I zoom in a little bit closer, the stroke extends a decent amount past the original box. If I were to go ahead and select this entire object, and then I'll explain what these do a little bit more in just a second here. If I were to run, for example, a merge on it, it deletes our stroke. So one thing you might want to do before you get started with any object is to expand the strokes on all the objects. To do that, just highlight over the object using the selection tool. It's the black arrow and it's V on your keyboard as a shortcut by default. And then go to Object, Expand. You want to make sure fill and stroke are both checked right here on the screen and hit OK. And then one more thing to think about when you're doing this. As you can tell when I highlight over just this box right here, there's different lines showing the original box in this inner line, and then this outer box is the 2 lines of the actual stroke. For a lot of these effects, this is just fine, but if I were to run a minus front on this, it once again deletes the outline strokes, and we don't want that to happen. So what you can do very quickly to solve that, and this is very specific for subtracting things outside of boxes like this, just highlight over the object you want to expand, and then the first option here, which is the first option I will cover, is called Unite. It's right here on the Pathfinder window. Just hit that, and Unite will combine all these different objects together. And then if I were to go ahead, select this all over again, and then run the minus front, it works just as you would expect it to. It keeps all those stroke lines the way they were, and then subtracts the actual elements in the center here. And something else to think about here, here's the box again. Now the stroke is still live. If I were to run that same minus front on this object, it now applies the stroke to those objects in the middle that were removed, because those objects in the middle were just solid objects. There wasn't any stroke. So that does add a little bit of versatility to this. If you want the objects you subtract to still have the same stroke as the object, for example, if I change the color of this stroke really quick so we can just see it better here, the stroke's applied there. But if you want it to be an exact subtraction, you want to make sure you expand everything. But here on my screen, I have all the different options in the order that they are in the actual Pathfinder window, and I am inside Adobe Illustrator CC. If you're in a version older than CS6, these options might look different. For example, minus front in previous versions, I believe, was called subtract, but there should be a decent amount of similarities here. So I'm going to quickly cover all these different options and give a brief explanation of what each of them do, and then I'll let you know which ones I tend to use the most. So the first one's Unite, and I use Unite quite a bit for the same reasons I just showed, where I might want to subtract an object, but I want to make sure it looks just the way I drew it. So to use all these modes, you just want to highlight over all the objects you want to apply the Pathfinder effect to. So I want to apply to all these. So I highlight all these using the selection tool. And remember, that's just the black arrow. V is a keyboard shortcut by default. And then I'll hit this button on the upper left here. Looks like 2 boxes overlapping, and it's called Unite. And what this does is it changes everything to the same color, and that's important to keep in mind when you're doing Unite. It'll convert everything to the same color, and then it combines the appearance of all the objects together. So as you can see, these circles were overlapping the outside the box, and these two were in the middle. So because these are in the middle of the black box, it'll just combine them right into this black box right here, and you won't see them at all anymore. And what this is really useful for, let's say I want to apply a unified stroke to an object like this, I can go ahead, hit the Unite button, and then I can go ahead and I'm just going to switch from the fill to the stroke by hitting this little swap arrow button right here. So now we have an outline that perfectly follows the path of the outside of this object here. And then you can go ahead and add in a custom fill if that's something you want to do. So that's a really fast and easy way to go ahead and do that. If it's important for you that all the objects on this stay the same color and you don't lose any of the objects on the inside here, there is another option called Merge that'll perfectly solve that problem for you that I'll get to in just a bit. So next up on the list here is the second from the left on the top, and it's called minus front. In older versions, I'm pretty sure it was called subtract, although I don't remember for sure. And as the name suggests, that subtracts any objects you have placed on top of an object in the back. So if I highlight over this and hit minus front right here, it'll subtract those objects in the front. Between Unite, minus front, and then Merge on the bottom that I'll get to in a bit, these are personally my most used objects inside the Pathfinder window. It can be really useful to quickly subtract items from the inside of an object like this. Then I can go ahead and apply a stroke to this if I wanted to do that. It does a nice job of following what we created there. Although it is worth noting that if you try to subtract objects from really detailed, complex things with a lot of different objects, like let's say you have a font and you want to subtract a texture from the font, you might have to go in on a letter by letter basis, because sometimes subtract will freak out a bit if you have a whole lot of objects and it can't properly understand what it's subtracting from what. So if you ever try to hit subtract and it just ends up deleting a large portion of your work, you might have to ungroup those items and then subtract items from it on an item by item basis. So next up is intersect, and that's right here on the screen. It's third from the left. If I hit it, what it does is it subtracts everything except the intersecting object paths. So if I go back here, you can look at these two squares, and right here is a square that was formed in the middle by these two items intersecting. So when I highlight over them, you can see that only this object that is now intersecting will be saved when I hit the intersect button. So that's sort of an alternative way to subtract items from other items if you want to do it that way. And exclude right here is almost the exact same as intersect, but the opposite. So right here, two boxes overlapping. This time it'll only save the objects that aren't intersecting. So it'll save this box and this box on the outside. If I hit it right here, it's fourth from the left on the shape modes. You can tell that it subtracted the intersecting object and just left these two objects on the outside. So now to the Pathfinder options. And these are a little bit more complex in general, but some of them are very useful, especially the merge, and I think for a lot of people crop will come in quite handy. So right here is divide. And what divide does is it basically splits up each object into its own object. So let me just add another circle on top of this right here so we can see what we're doing a little bit better. But if I were to highlight over all these objects and hit divide, it goes ahead and makes each of these different intersecting paths its own object now. So if I were to select this square that was created in the middle and move it off, that's now its own object, and this right here is now its own object. Now moving all these using the direct selection tool, which is the white arrow on the toolbar. It's A as a keyboard shortcut by default. So dividing is pretty helpful if you have a complex object and you want to make each of the overlapping different paths its own thing, and then you can go ahead and remove certain sections you want to remove, change the individual color of different elements. Like let's say you don't want this to be black, you could quickly go in there, change it to be a new color, and it's pretty quick and easy to do when you use the divide tool to do that. Now trim and merge are almost the exact same thing with one very slight difference. So I'm going to go ahead and run both these. I'm going to highlight over this whole thing, which is second from the left on the Pathfinder toolbar. And then I'm also going to highlight over this one and hit merge, which is third from left on the toolbar. And I'm just going to highlight over both these so we can see the one really subtle difference that happens when we do this. The big difference here is that trim treats overlapping objects like these two circles right here as two separate objects. So if I move these off, we now have two separate circles, whereas merge will merge all similar colors together. So these two circles are now one circle object, as you can see right here. And these are both really handy if you have really complex objects that you want to simplify down. Particularly merge, I tend to use merge a whole lot, where I might have a very complex object with a bunch of different paths all intersecting, and then I want to go in and manipulate specific colors, but I don't want to have to select a whole bunch of different complex objects all at once. I'll just merge it down to be one more simplified object, so all the overlapping things like these two circles right here, I could then go in, change those colors pretty quickly, and then just work from there. And trim is much more useful if you really want to make sure you preserve all the individual shapes, or if you wanted to just change, let's say, change this circle's color and then change this circle's color, or whatever it is you're trying to accomplish. Trim will save those slight details that merge just flattens down. Next up we have crop, and I think crop will be really useful for a lot of people, and what it does is that it allows you to use a shape on the top right here to crop out whatever's behind it. So if I highlight over this and then hit crop, which is right here in the Pathfinder, it crops out these lines in the back to the shape of the square that I drew over it. I have this square colored here so that's a little bit easier to see on the screen what I'm doing, but if I hit this white box with the red line through it right here to turn the fill to nothing, if I highlight over this you can tell there's still the box right here, and if I hit crop again, it'll still crop to that shape, and that's helpful if you want to just select this overall object and you really want to see what's behind it a little bit better so you can line things up a little bit better. You can go ahead and do that, or you can have it a solid fill like I did before. Either way it'll work, and it's a nice way to crop images into a shape of your choice. So outline can be helpful if you want to create a nice stroke to trap in colors. Outline can be helpful for doing that. So if I highlight over this and then I hit outline, which is right here on the Pathfinder window, it's turned everything in here into a really thin outline, so I can go ahead and increase the stroke size a little bit bigger here so you can see what it did. It's just a really quick way to create an outline of the object that you had created, and where that comes in handy with something like screen printing, sometimes you want a thicker stroke around the object so that if there's a little bit of misregistration, the actual fill from this larger outline will go ahead and fill in those areas so you can't see the mistakes. And minus back is the last one here, and it's almost the exact same thing as minus front, but as the name suggests, it subtracts from the back. So if I highlight over this, you can tell that these circles are behind the square. If I just quickly remove this square, you can see where they are right there. If you highlight over all the objects and hit the minus back button, which is right here in the Pathfinder, it'll subtract them from that square. I personally can't think of a really good usage scenario where you'd want to subtract things from the back like this instead of just placing them on the front and then subtracting them. But if you want to work that way, that's certainly an option that you can do right there. But that covers the basics of the Pathfinder window, and like I said before, I tend to use unite, minus front, and then merge almost all the time when I'm creating things inside Illustrator. It's just a quick way to combine or manipulate objects. When you're working inside Illustrator, you create things a little bit faster, but there's definitely a lot of tools to choose from here, and you can go ahead and figure out which ones work best for your work style. But I do hope this video was helpful for you, and if it was, please like and favorite. And if you want to see more stuff like this every week, please subscribe. I do my best to put out new content just like this every week. So, thanks for watching.